The TeachPitch podcast. We are very excited to be launching a series of interviews for TeachPitch, a global community of 50,000 subscribers from over 205 countries to date. And for these interviews, we have selected a number of subscribers who have achieved great things. And by great, I mean amazing. Think of former presidents, entrepreneurs, people who've built hospitals, huge non-profit organizations, successful journalists, doctors, etc. And what all our guests have in common is that despite their great success, they've encountered many enormous challenges. So what were these challenges and how did they overcome them? That's what we're going to be talking about here. My name is Aldo and I'm massively looking forward and very grateful you can join us on this journey. So sit back, relax and download the podcast here.
Children have to walk far distances. Isolation is tremendous. So we have to see how we can build social fabric between the school, the parents, and the community. And this is what we wanted. We wanted a nice, safe learning environment, a child-friendly school.
In this episode, we talk with our guest how she went about making a profound structural change in education in her home country, Colombia. We speak about her challenges, from how difficult it was in getting the initial buy-in from the Colombian government to how challenging it was to ensure the sustainability of her program with many destabilizing changes going on in her country of origin. Enjoy this interview with Vicky Colbert, founder of Escuela Nueva. Ms. Vicky Colbert is founder and director of Fundación Escuela Nueva, an NGO committed to improving the quality, relevance and efficiency of education by rethinking the way we learn. The best way to describe the Escuela Nueva model is as an innovative way of looking at students and offering them customized support at scale regardless of the circumstances and environments they grow up in. Ms. Colbert is a sociologist from Javeriana University in Colombia. She pursued her graduate studies in Sociology of Education and Comparative International Education at Stanford University and has pioneered, expanded and sustained educational innovation from many organizations. So previously as Vice Minister of Education of Colombia and as UNICEF's Education Advisor for the Latin American countries. She has been recognized with several awards and distinctions in the fields of leadership and social entrepreneurship, such as the Skoll Award for Social Entrepreneurship, 2013 Wise Prize for Education, the Clinton Global Citizenship Award, and the Kravis Prize. She has also been recognized as Outstanding Social Entrepreneur by the Schwab Foundation, Ashoka, and the World Technology Network. The Escuela Nueva approach to date has been implemented in thousands of schools in Colombia and is being exported to many other countries as we speak. In 2017, Vicky was also awarded with the Yildan Prize for Education, and for very good reasons. The jury was full of praise to Escuela Nueva and its unique approach, stating that Ms. Colbert's work demonstrates that high-quality schooling can be cost-effective in the harshest environments. Her model excels in developing both intellectual and social-emotional capacities of its students. An inspiring testament to the fact that well-rounded, progressive education is not a privilege reserved for students in developed economies. Vicky Colbert describes her own journey as one similar to that of the fairy tale Cinderella, stating, "We started with the most invisible and remote schools and they ended up looking like the schools of the future. For us, necessity is the mother of innovation." Vicky, a very warm welcome to you.
Thank you very much, Aldo. It's a pleasure to be here with you. And I'm bringing you regards from Colombia.
Thank you so much. Where are you in Colombia today?
I'm in Bogota. It's up in the mountains in the Andes, and we love it. And I've lived here all my life.
Great. But before we start talking about Escuela Nueva, could you give us an impression of the state of Colombia today? So has it been shaken up by the COVID crisis? Could you give us an idea?
Yes, like all countries, the COVID situation was strong, and our Latin American spirit is not necessarily the most disciplined spirit, so sometimes our social indiscipline is not that good as we would like to. But I think we had a very responsible, I think the government was, very much bringing every single day World Health Organization, Pan American Health Organization, John Hopkins. So we were monitoring the COVID situation. But since 2019, before the COVID situation, Latin America was going through a lot of social instability, starting in Chile, starting in Ecuador, and in all these other countries. And Colombia, of course, we have a lot of inequality. And also, of course, we have a lot of ex-guerrillas and unfortunately, drug dealers that hide in Venezuela, unfortunately. So we live permanently we have 2 million migrant Venezuelans we're working with, by the way. We have adapted Escuela Nueva to work with migrant children in Colombia, Venezuelan children especially. But of course, these last months, especially April and May, were very, we were going through a difficult time because there were protests everywhere. And, Colombia was I think the second democracy in Latin America. So Colombia is a democracy. However, we've had a lot of infiltration from guerrillas and drug dealers in all the Pacific demonstrations. They start Pacific, a lot of mobilization everywhere, a lot of students. There are dialogues all over. It's a highly decentralized country. But unfortunately, we've had some very violent, after the protest, we have vandalism with people, that they have their heads covered and nobody knows who they are. So unfortunately, things that start in a very positive way, even supported by the government, because the government accompanies the protests. But however, unfortunately, at the end of the protest, especially at night, we've had a lot of violence and destruction. Yeah. And of course, a lot of strategies also to kill the president. So, we've been going through very, very serious situations, and especially because of the alliance between drug dealers, ex-guerrilla fighters, and they come kill in Colombia and then they go hide in Venezuela. So this is very tough.
Wow. And so today, what is the government like today? Is it a stable situation with the government?
It's a stable situation, but of course, all these things in our democracies are very vulnerable because we also have presidential elections next year. So in addition to the social instability, the high inequality we have in Latin America is one of the continents in the world where there's the highest inequality. So there are structural reasons.
Well, the government is basically a very important actor for you because looking at your challenges, the challenges that we're going to discuss later in this interview, you talk a lot about policy and how you as an organization needed to get involved with policy to make sure that Escuela Nueva could grow, that your initiative could grow. So is that something that you thought you would be focused on when you started the initiative?
From the outset. The first thing we did was build on what already existed. I mean, I think it's an error to start from scratch. All countries have accumulated findings. So we already built on what already existed in Colombia. Escuela Unitaria, the unitary school promoted by UNESCO, was trying to see these rural, isolated, multi-grade schools all over the world. And they had already brought some strategies, but some strategies to try to personalize education. But unfortunately, it was not very much structured and planned. So even the teachers were against the Escuela Unitaria, the UNESCO proposal and the government's proposal. So what I started doing was working with rural Colombian teachers that knew how things were on the ground. And when we started seeing what already existed, La Escuela Unitaria from UNESCO, we saw that it was not easily replicable nor scalable. And we wanted, since the outset, we wanted to impact national policy. We wanted all rural schools in Colombia to be changed and to be reformed. And so definitely we started with the innovation. I started working with the rural teachers. And some of the teachers, unfortunately, the teacher who's co-authored with me of Escuela Nueva, he passed away already. But it was wonderful to start working with these teachers that were working already on innovations, that were trying to do things. but it was not scalable, it was not replicable, it was not cost effective. So the first thing that we were forced, Aldo, to think systemically from the outset, because if we wanted to make a change with the way of working with the children, of how children could learn in a different way. And by the way, nothing of what we introduced is new in the philosophy of education. These things have been said for ages. Maria Montessori, John Dewey, Vygotsky, all these, these ideas came to Colombia mainly to the elite schools, not to the poorest of the poor. So what we wanted was to bring these great ideas, which are also peace-oriented, and we wanted to incorporate them. So we started building on what already existed in the country, in La Escuela Unitaria, and I started working with the rural Colombian teachers. So we designed Escuela Nueva, and we started bottom up, but I wanted it to be a national policy. So how did we start doing it? We started working in the rural parts of Colombia, having some demonstration sites. And of course, as always, you have to start looking for funds. So we did have support at that moment to innovate, to start working on the design of Escuela Nueva. We had support from USAID. And so we started working within the ministry, Aldo. I was the first national coordinator of Escuela Nueva within the Ministry of Education. Wow, what does this mean? It means a lot of things and it doesn't mean much. So the first thing you have to do is look for the money, have a team. So I started bringing the rural teachers as part of my team in the Ministry of Education.
Oh, very good.
I don't know why I was so lucky that I had the support from the minister, the vice minister, the planning officer, because they saw that I was young, full of energy. I was really trying to innovate, working with the rural teachers. So they sort of gave me certain protection, but in a way I was hiding from the bureaucracy, Aldo. I was really hiding because anything you want to change within a bureaucracy, it's very tough. It's very difficult. So we were forced to think cost effectively because we were always thinking of having it as a national policy. And we wanted it to be easily replicable. So we started working bottom up. We had visual images. We wanted to have the demonstration sites of schools so I could start influencing the important politicians within the ministry. And also to have results. I think it was so important. I think a little bit of the only part I have of being a sociologist behind me is that I still value a lot empirical results. Yeah. So I think it was so important when we started seeing results. So, I started taking one by one all these important leaders, political people in the ministry that could make decisions. So I started taking them one by one to these isolated areas. If I could put them on a burro up the mountain, and I also did it just so that they would see what it means to work in a very rural, isolated setting.
Good. Wow. Thank you. That's and this almost brings us to your first challenge. But before we do so, I would like you to talk a little bit about the distinction between rural life and city life, because I think in a country like Colombia, that is a massive difference. Am I correct?
Yes. A big difference is, our geography, especially our geography in Colombia, it facilitates a lot of isolation because of the mountains, and children have to walk long time to get to schools. I was up in the little house in the valley, but going through mountains and difficult areas. There's no connectivity in rural areas in Colombia like in the rest of Latin America. So we have to understand what that means, especially now that we went last year through the COVID situation, which was good for us. It forced us to be more creative. But the point is that children have to walk far distances. Isolation is tremendous. So we have to see how we can build social fabric between the school, the parents, and the community. And this is what we wanted. We wanted a nice, safe learning environment, a child-friendly school. Because, by the way, we have inspired a lot of all these concepts in other organizations.
Yeah. So because of the setup of your country geographically, and the challenges with, having many rural schools in the mountains, you had lots of kids who effectively stayed behind in the rural schools. They were not offered the same opportunities. So that was a core problem, correct?
The core problem is Colombia, like the rest of Latin America, didn't guarantee not even complete primary education at that moment, Aldo. So it was just universal basic education, what we were looking for. Quality basic education that any child. Now remember, Colombia has a lot of diversity. We have mountains, but we have jungles. the jungle part of Colombia close to Brazil and the Amazon part. That's a different thing. But still, these are remote areas. So at that time, Colombia was mostly rural, like the rest of Latin America. It started changing because in the last 20 years, Colombia became urbanized.
Yeah.
Okay. We'll talk about that later.
We'll talk about that later. And then you personally, so you come from a family of educators, right? Your mother was a teacher, correct?
My mother was she was really an educator ahead of her time, Colombian. She had opportunities to study also abroad. She studied in the United States, but she was an amazing teacher. She founded teachers' colleges in Colombia. So I had the best example with my mother, always leading projects, leading initiatives, and having a tremendous pedagogical conception. So it was wonderful to have her as my mentor.
Yeah. Oh, well, that's good. So she directly inspired you to get into this as well.
Oh, yes, definitely.
Yeah.
And in addition, of course, as a sociologist, one knows that you cannot reduce inequality or you cannot have peace or citizenship building if you don't have quality basic education. This is, for me, quality basic education is the priority. It's a 101.
Yeah. 101, yeah. And then I've read your godfather, he was a minister of education.
Oh, my godfather, he was, Well, in Colombia, being a Catholic country, we had godfathers and godmothers, and my godfather, he was minister of education, and he brought to Colombia, the best thinkers, from France at that moment, the movements of L'École Nouvelle. So they brought Descartes and they brought them to Colombia. And they were inspiring really the elite schools. Even though he was Minister of Education, he was thinking of the public schools. But it was interesting because all these ideas came to Colombia when he was the minister. Yeah.
Yeah. So then your first challenge, so you're full speed ahead and you're trying to get your model off the ground, and then your challenge is, of course, to introduce a seemingly local innovation within a government entity. And in order to scale, you needed to transform it into a public policy. So that's a journey from, the concrete case study from, I can imagine, one rural school into, okay, how are we going to apply this to all schools in Colombia?
So
Tell me a little bit about that journey. Yeah.
We started with just a couple of schools as innovators, but then we started working in 3 regions, having pilot schools, not pilot schools, demo schools, demonstration schools, simply where it was well implemented. And then we started taking teachers from other parts to see these schools, because I think I should have mentioned one of the challenges. I mentioned more the issues of sustainability and getting and impacting national policy. I touched those things. But there are also many challenges. Like, for example, how do you change teachers' attitudes? Okay. So, we had to think of very pragmatic things. Like, first, that teachers see a school. They have a visual image. They go see it. Why, Aldo? So they can say, we can do it. So this is the essential of our teacher training strategy component. We have a curriculum component, a teacher training component, a community component, and an administrative component. So with the teacher training, the first thing is that they see a school so they can say, we can do this. So we start a demand-driven approach, bottom up. A second thing is that teachers be trained with the same methodology they would be using with their children, because this was the biggest challenge. How can we ask teachers to make the change when they were trained in a different way, when they were educated in a different way? So they tend to reproduce. So this was the second challenge, let's say, technical challenge. And the third challenge, for changing the teachers' attitudes and behaviors was not leave them alone. So we created what we call the micro centers, which are teachers' learning circles among themselves. So they would get together, share their frustrations, share their innovations. But we had learned that teachers learn more from other teachers than from experts. So these were the 3 things that were challenges, technical challenge, but we tended to overcome them. And they were the essential of what we started doing in our work with the schools.
Yeah. And 2 things come to mind. First of all, I 100% agree with you that the peer-to-peer learning element is a lot stronger and goes a lot further than a top-down approach. So from teacher to teacher, using lots of use cases and concrete stories that are experience-based rather than an academic theory, because that's very abstract for a teacher to understand. So 100% agreed on that. The second thing is I read that it wasn't received very warmly in the beginning by the teachers. Is that correct? They were very skeptical. Could you tell us why?
Yes. Well, first of all, they had received, let's say, the previous inheritance of La Escuela Unitaria from UNESCO. So the only thing they had in mind is that they had a lot of work. It was one teacher working with several grades. So the first thing they said is, they're going to eliminate teachers. Multi-grade schools eliminate teachers. So this was the first thing they were going to protest against, especially unions. They're very strong in Latin America. So they were first very much against Escuela Unitaria. And then, since they saw Escuela Nueva was born out of the Escuela Unitaria, then they had the same. So this is why we had to design and make changes with the teachers so that they could see what were the changes we had made. First of all, that they didn't have to elaborate so much material as they had to elaborate so many teachers, so many learning guides as they had to do it in Escuela Unitaria. This was one of the reasons why they were against it. No. The second reason, how could you ask the teachers to make the change where they were trained, and the teacher training was extremely traditional? We had to really focus on changing the whole thing. We were forced to think of transform all this complexity into very simple, manageable action and make things experiential. So the first things we wanted teachers to make sure is that, they would click with it. And once the teachers started seeing Escuela Nueva, not Escuela Unitaria, but Escuela Nueva, where teachers didn't have to elaborate so many materials by themselves. So we would not let them alone, where they were trained in a very practical, experiential way. So we started changing their attitudes, and this was the first thing. So they became the first defenders of Escuela Nueva, were the Escuela Nueva teachers against the other teachers in the rest of the country. So we started creating like a teachers movement. And this was wonderful because they were the agents of change, the Escuela Nueva teachers. This was fantastic. This was really fantastic. We were growing a movement, a pedagogical movement.
That's good. And the more teachers caught on, the more you were able to transform it into a public policy. So from almost on a grassroots level, demonstrate to government that this was something that was going to stick around. Yeah.
Exactly. But of course, I had to knock on the door of national planning. Colombia has a very important national planning office that is beyond the ministries. So this was crucial to work with them. So I was moving. I was moving strategically with the right persons and the right organizations and the right institutions.
Okay. When exactly are we talking about here? So this is at the very beginning of the organization?
Aldo, this is one of the longest innovations. So Escuela Nueva, we started in 1976. Can you imagine? We were starting, moving it up. Everything, by the way, everything takes time. And even in education, results take time. You cannot see results immediately. Education results don't coincide with the political momentums. And this is one of the problems that exist in all developing countries in all Latin America. So we wanted, first of all, to demonstrate that it became gradually a national policy in Colombia. We started in 3 regions of Colombia with 150 schools. And then we started looking more for more money, and then gradual expansion. But fortunately, we started having Escuela Nueva we reached 20,000 schools. And this was fantastic. These were rural, isolated 20,000 schools. So it became a national policy. By the way, in all this process, my personal situation, I was the first national coordinator of Escuela Nueva within the ministry. But I guess because of the results we had and the hard work I had, I was then named Vice Minister of Education. And so I became Vice Minister of Education when we took the political decision of taking it to 20,000 schools.
Oh, wow. That's great, because that was going to be my next question. What about the funding?
Exactly. So once you were in the Ministry of Education, it became gradually a national policy. Well, we needed the financial support. But behind this, Aldo, there's research. There's always evaluations. Since the outset, we started seeing better results in children of Escuela Nueva. So we have decades of accumulated scientific facts. We know it works well. We know children's self-esteem is boosted. I guess for me, this was the most important part. No? Yeah. In addition to peaceful behavior, to leadership issues, in addition to better results in academic achievement and all these things. And we reached 20,000 schools. We universalized for the first time in Colombia basic education.
And for how long were you vice minister?
I guess I was one of the vice ministers that stayed the longest, because usually vice ministers change every 6 months, and this is my big problem in Latin America. Okay, I was 2 long years. I actually worked with two ministers of education.
Okay, that's great. And then after, of course, you carried on your work, not as a vice minister, but for Escuela Nueva.
Then I was in UNICEF as the education advisor for the region.
Okay.
And I also I started bringing a lot of things of Escuela Nueva in inspiring the child-friendly concept in UNICEF and inspiring many other things. So we started working, because at that moment when Escuela Nueva had results, the World Bank selected it as one of the 3 innovations that had successfully impacted national policies. So we got a lot of countries coming into Colombia, a lot of countries brought by the World Bank, brought by USAID. I started sending Colombian teachers abroad. For example, Oscar Mogollon, who I worked with, he was the teacher I co-authored Escuela Nueva. I told him, Oscar, you have to go to Guatemala. Other teachers I sent to Brazil. Other teachers I sent to Paraguay. Other teachers I sent to different countries.
Yeah, elsewhere, yeah.
Just one of the countries that I want to highlight is Vietnam. The Vietnamese implemented Escuela Nueva in all their country. They took the political decision that we have not made it yet in Colombia because we're so decentralized. This is an issue. It's one of the challenges, which is good. It's wonderful to be decentralized, but it also it brings a lot of issues. Colombia, in many regions, we have not reached many regions of Colombia. But the Vietnamese took the political decision and they implemented in the whole country, and already there's an evaluation, impact evaluation from the World Bank. Fantastic. So I feel a little bit of positive envy of the Vietnamese. They did what we have not done yet, okay?
Well,
because here we have to talk with every local mayor, with every region. So it takes a little bit longer.
Because everyone needs to have their say. Yeah, yeah.
And then to maintain it.
Yeah, well, I mean, your second challenge is around sustaining it first. And I think you've addressed it with getting the funding, because I think, funding is essential to sustain it. But also, since you pointed out that you're the longest one going, as an initiative, one is the longest, but so you definitely succeeded in overcoming that challenge of sustaining. But how did you do it? Was it all a foreign aid in terms of funding, or was there anything else that allowed you to sustain?
Becoming a national policy in Colombia means that you have national funds from Colombia, from National Planning Office and the Finance Office, and also we had préstamos. We had loans from the World Bank and from Inter-American Development Bank, and UNICEF came into the picture also. So I left the Ministry of Education as vice minister. Escuela Nueva continued. The country decentralized. I ended up working in UNICEF in the whole region. So there was a moment I said to myself, I have to resign from UNICEF. I cannot let Escuela Nueva fade in Colombia, die where it was born, because we were in the whole decentralization process of Colombia, like the rest of Latin America. So the concentration of everybody is on the administrative issues. Everybody forgets the pedagogy. We're just learning who's going to handle the money, who's going to handle this, who's going to do this, who's going to, so we're in a big reorganization of the system. So what did we have to do with several ex-ministers of education? Although we created Fundación Escuela Nueva, I created the NGO. Okay, so you can see it in time. So we created the Escuela Nueva Foundation. We said, I'm not going to get the UN pension. I'm not going to get all these things from UNICEF. I had been invited to work already with the World Bank in Washington or with UNICEF in New York. But I said, no, I prefer to have a little bit more of autonomy. This is too much of a temptation to work as an international. But I prefer to be in Colombia and start the NGO with all these ex-ministers of education. So we created Fundación Escuela Nueva, which is an NGO, because we wanted, one, to protect the quality of Escuela Nueva. We wanted to make sure that it was well done. Once you give your baby to the government, this is complicated. There's quality, because we started seeing a lot of not very quality issues. And not only that, but we started the whole decentralization. Everybody was concentrated on the administrative parts. So I have learned, Aldo, that you have to work with governments if you want to have impact and coverage. But for two key words, quality and sustainability, you need public-private partnerships and the role of civil society. If I had not created Fundación Escuela Nueva, our small NGO, everybody could have said, oh, that very nice program, it was finished. Yeah, but since we already, universalized basic education and primary education, well, it's over with. It was very nice in the 90s or the 80s. But no, it's still alive. And this is precisely what we do in our Fundación. We try to work with the local governments, convince the local governments, put the picture again. And this is what we continue doing in Colombia and abroad in other countries also.
That is such a clever move, that you set up an NGO that basically guarantees the quality of a program that has been already fully adopted by the government.
Exactly.
To sustain its quality, right?
And to continue innovating, because then we adapted it to displaced and migrant children, the Venezuelan children that are permanently crossing the border.
Yeah.
We created Escuela Nueva learning circles. I can send you there's a recent publication by the World Bank on these learning circles for migrant population. And we also adapted it to urban areas, Escuela Activa Urbana. We wanted to demonstrate that it can also be done it's just good pedagogy. So we wanted to demonstrate that it can also be done in urban areas. Of course, our priority continues to be rural areas because that's where the necessity is.
Yeah, that's where the need is the highest.
The only problem is we see exactly the same in other countries that happened in Colombia. Exactly the same. You get the pilot started, you get the government involved, they get interested, and then boom, there's a change of government and everything falls down. So it's good if you have another organization from private sector or civil society on the ground in the country where you're going to work. Even the Vietnamese, when the vice minister left his position as the vice minister, he created an NGO. And he called me the other day. He said, look, I'm doing exactly the same you're doing. Not even in a different government, a different type of government.
It's a very clever move, Vicky. It's been a very clever move setting up that NGO. So well done. We're going to your third challenge. Again, I think you've addressed a couple of points already. Just to repeat, you basically said, okay, we're now becoming kind of a government program, but all the movements within the government, such as the decentralization of policies and loads of administrative issues, are going to have its effect on the pedagogy. And also you saw that a lot of the reforms that took place in the region, and they were all around administration and administrative issues, but had nothing to do with pedagogy. Now, you already mentioned that in order to tackle this challenge, you set up the NGO. But could you explain to us a little bit more detail what you mean with decentralization?
I am for decentralization. I totally agree with it, and for democracy. The problem is when you're in the middle of, let's say, when you're moving from one house to another, not necessarily are you really thinking about innovations at that moment, okay? So you're really taking care of the whole apparato, the whole structure. And I think what I like decentralization, but the problem was that in the moment of expansion of Escuela Nueva, the country became decentralized. So now it was not only the national ministry talking, with the regions, but it was also now trying to convince the different regional governors and the regional mayors. So it's not the best platform, when your administration is permanently changing and you're reorganizing the whole thing. I mentioned these administrative issues because it's tough to tackle with governments and with ministries and bureaucracy. But as I mentioned, we had many technical challenges, teachers' attitudes and behaviors, so many issues, even attitudes of the parents. Even the parents at the beginning, they said they're just playing. They're not doing what we used to do. They're learning less. Until they started seeing that children didn't want to leave the schools because they were so happy in a new learning environment. Okay.
Yeah. Vicky, thank you so much for explaining that. And it really gives me a very good grasp of the context you were operating in. When did you actually realize that the world was watching with you? Because in the beginning, in the introduction, I mentioned so many prizes that you have been awarded and for good reasons. And these are not prizes for the faint of heart, I'd like to say. And so the WISE prize for education is $500,000, if I'm correct. The Gildan prize, these are very big prizes and important prizes, specifically on the level of education. when did you kind of notice that, hey, there's a global value to Escuela Nueva?
When we started seeing results in other countries, we had people from Zambia coming to Colombia, and they were so happy to what they were seeing. The Vietnamese, the Chinese in 2019, so many. And then we said, but this is so simple. Precisely the beauty is how simple it can be and how easily replicable and scalable. And I think it's a proven solution that can help many other countries that want to improve quality education in the rural areas or in their basic education schools. So we really wanted to focus on that quality issue and the change of the role of the teacher. Right? I mean, this is the challenge, the change of the role of the teacher, the change of the role of the student, that we were really child-centered. This is nothing new, but it's just that we have been for so many years teacher-centered, transmitters of information. So this was the big challenge, technically speaking. But once we had things on the ground and we had things to show, we wanted to share them with everybody else, and we wanted to ensure that there was important research behind. So when we started seeing results, not only on academic achievement, but on peaceful behavior, Aldo, and this is so important, on democratic behavior and peaceful behavior. And so this was another little trick I had to do. That the first publication was done by University of London, so that when Colombians would read it, it was published first in the University of London. Why? Because sometimes people here in Latin America, we only believe what foreigners say. We do not believe on our own innovation. So I wanted that we believe on ourselves. Okay. So it took a lot of work and a lot of leadership, but we managed to do it. And I like to quote. This is not mine. I learned it from somebody else the other day, but I said, this is the perfect image of what happens in education. In the health sector, if you bring a doctor from 100 years ago, that doctor, and you bring him into a hospital today, that doctor is completely lost because that hospital has changed so much. But if I bring a teacher from 100 years ago and bring her into a classroom today, even in an elite school in the U.S. or here in Colombia or wherever, that teacher is not so lost because everything has changed except the way of learning. Okay. Here what we wanted to really focus was on that teacher-student relationship. We really wanted to change the role of the teacher and that they become much more, rich in empathy, in love, in affection for these children that have such difficulties, even just to reach school. Okay. So I guess this were our challenges, technical and administratively.
So now Fundación Escuela Nueva is there. The organization, how big is the organization?
Well, we've been growing because, with all these prices, that has helped us a lot.
So how many people are working with you on the ground?
We have something like 60 or 70 at this moment. The NGO has been growing. Yes. So we have a lot of projects going on, and, so with the projects we grow, and sometimes we have to reduce ourselves also.
Well, lots of projects going on, lots of people active, but also impact on thousands and thousands of teachers and students and schools. What would you say to the next generation of Vicky Colberts out there? So taking you back to 1976, someone with a dream to transform education, what would you advise to
follow your dreams? You have to feel this wonderful energy of always trying to do something good for somebody else. And, without quality basic education, we cannot achieve 21st century skills. I mean, this is the other thing. Without basic quality education, there's no social development, no financial development. There's nothing. I mean, quality basic education for me is crucial. Early child and basic education. So, I mean, if this is the basis of everything. So sometimes, for example, you asked me about, what the government has been doing. This was before all the protests. Already free university for the lowest socioeconomic groups, free university. I mean, this was done way before, and this was one of the things that students were asking for. Okay, free university. So it's not that easy for a developing country. No. But the government has been leading this initiative since the beginning of the COVID situation. So in a way, these are things that the government has been working on, and I think they're moving on the right direction. So I think these things are positive. But for me, sometimes when I say, I hope the universities don't take so much money away from the children, this is my problem. When you start thinking about financial aspects of a sector, little children don't protest. Only university students protest. Well, they got the free university, but students of the rural areas, we have to fight for them. Nobody speaks for them. So in a way, I guess my recommendation is follow your dreams, follow your good energy, and always believe that you can make changes. Yes, it's possible. Yes, we can. It is possible. But you have to think of how to do it.
You have to think of it. Yeah, definitely. And I just wanted to share with our listeners that we've met several times in Doha, where we were at the World Innovation Summit for Education. And I remember the first time that we bumped into each other, or I bumped into you, you might not recall, was in 2014. You were a laureate of the prize in 2013. So I naturally knew who you were. And I was kind of lost because I was there on my own. I had just started Teach Pitch. And I looked in your direction and greeted you, and you were so kind. You came up to me, and we had this very nice chat. And then someone came up to me and said, oh, you spoke to Vicky Colbert. Did you know that she was the laureate and whatever? It's like, well, no, I didn't have an idea. But you really took me by the hand almost and showed me around and say, well, this is the world of global education. So thank you for that. Thank you for introducing me to that specific part of the world. And it was a very warm welcome for me to, of course, the platform that is WISE, but also all these endeavors that are going on all over the world for people like yourselves who are trying to make an effort to change education for the better. So thanks for that. We're almost at the end of this interview, Vicky. I would like to ask you two very last questions, if I may. And I always ask these questions to all my guests. One is recommended reading. What are you reading at the moment, or what book would you recommend to our listeners to read? You know, a book that inspires you, or a book maybe practical that can help them find out more about the Escuela Nueva or thinking, or, you know, anything like that.
What I'm reading right now is something I'm reading a very old book, old book of theologists and religious people, especially in Christianity. And it's an old book I found in a library of an uncle of mine. He was a historian. And so I'm reading his book on all these traditions. It's so interesting to learn the history of Colombia and of Spain and how similar we are. And of course, the Spanish writers had a tremendous influence in Colombia, tremendous. So I should send you the name of the book because it's so old, but I'm looking fascinating at it. I'll send you the name because it's Marquez de Mela. It's like a poem, a Spanish poet, and so I'm going over that book.
Yeah. And overall, is there one book that you would say, you know, here, read this book? This is just an overall recommendation.
Everything about Madre de Calcuta. I think for me, she's very inspiring as a human being, you know.
Mother Teresa, is that correct?
Mother Teresa de Calcuta, yes. For me, extraordinary. Just the capacity of giving herself in such a way. I really admire that very much as a person. And so I admire that very much.
Wow. Okay, so look for readings on Mother Teresa, and then, of course, on Colombia, and, of course, the difficult relationship between Colombia and Spain throughout history. You know, I can imagine that's
love and hate, because we're very Spanish.
Correct, yeah, love and hate. Yeah, I didn't want to say, that's why I said complicated relationship. Yeah, I'm sure it wasn't an easy one, or it isn't an easy one. And then the very last question. Now let's turn the tables. This is your podcast series, and you are the interviewer. Who would you like to interview?
Well, I would love to interview you, Aldo. Why not? Since when I met you in WISE so many years ago, and just to see what you've achieved and how you've achieved it, you know, and you've touched exactly the issue. Teachers don't have time for planning everyday wonderful lesson tools. So, you know, how you have so many, Teach Pitch has so many platforms. I mean, this is just amazing. We should work together. I mean, you have what we do not have, no, and maybe we have what you do not have. So why not? Why not? And so I definitely would love to see how you've done it. It's amazing. It's really amazing. And you're touching an issue that we did touch in Escuela Nueva. I didn't touch it very much, which is the teachers don't have time to write teachers' learning guides every single day for children. The intelligent questions that are behind that you make children. So I think here, this would be really interesting if we could share some of our little tricks that we do, Aldo, between Teach Pitch and Escuela Nueva, because precisely our learning guides are to compensate for that Teach Pitch issue.
Wow.
Okay?
Thank you so much. I consider myself cordially invited, and let's definitely continue the conversation. I'm more than happy to do that. Thank you for naming me as your guest, and let's set that up as well.
One more thing. I want to invite you to Renueva, which is our virtual campus. We were forced to strengthen our virtual campus last year for teachers, not for children, because teachers in rural areas don't have access. But the teachers,
Okay.
yes, in the small towns. So now we're training teachers virtually in Colombia, in the most remote areas. So it would be great, Aldo, seriously, if we could talk more about what types of things you would recommend that we have in all the work we're doing virtually at the moment. It would be fantastic with the platforms.
Vicky, I can only say one thing. Let's do it wherever we can help. Vicky Colbert, thank you so much for all the hard work you've put into Escuela Nueva, having a positive impact on the lives of so many learners, teachers, and schools all over the world. It's been a great honor interviewing you. It's a great pleasure knowing you. And it was great having you as our guest. Thank you so much, Vicky Colbert.
Thank you very much, Aldo, for inviting me. It's wonderful to be your guest.
If you liked this episode of the Teach Pitch podcast, then it would mean the absolute world if you could share it with your friends and or give it a short review on your preferred podcast platform. The more you share your ideas about these interviews, the more people will find out about them. So do let us know what you think. We'd be very, very grateful.
Special thanks to Kevin MacLeod for our beautiful theme music, Le Grand Chase. This podcast was produced and edited by Natalie Piles. Project coordination by Inva Cheney.